They say love can work miracles, but it also makes people do crazy things, the finale of which can be someone's death. In today's story, we go back more than 30 years to the beginning of 1993, to Innisfail, a town located in Queensland in the northeastern part of Australia. Gabriel Meyer was born in 1976 and was the second child in the large family of Sherry and Doug. The Meyers had 6 children in total. Despite their number, all the siblings were very close to each other. Their mother, Sherry, was fully devoted to raising them and completely immersed herself in her family. Their father, Doug, was a boat builder and sometimes took the boys with him to work. At that time, the Meyers lived in Miami, Florida, where they were originally from. At some point, Doug decided to move his wife and children to a safer place. The crime rate in Florida during those years was very high, so the Meyers relocated to Australia, to the friendly and idyllic town of Innisfail, considering it the most suitable place for living and raising children. The family settled in a beautiful house right by the river, about a year and a half before the incident took place. Gabe grew up as an enterprising, active, and athletic young man. He was also described as a very mature and responsible individual, highly reliable and caring. Everyone who knew Gabe loved him and believed that he had a bright future ahead. It's not hard to imagine what his parents went through when their eldest son never came home one day. On January 12, 1993, it was just an ordinary Tuesday. School was on break, so 17-year-old Gabe decided to go to the gym for a workout that day. He asked his father to give him a ride, and since it was on Doug's way, he agreed. He dropped his son off at the local gym and went about his business, expecting to see Gabe again in a couple of hours. When Doug returned home for dinner, his son was still not there. The clock showed around 6:30 p.m. After waiting until 8 p.m., the family sat down for dinner, but Gabe still hadn't shown up. Doug and Sherry didn't think much of it at first. After all, Gabriel was a grown 17-year-old young man. That's the age when freedom and independence seem the most appealing. At first, the parents genuinely thought that maybe he had simply run into a friend, gotten caught up in conversation, and lost track of time. Sherry and Doug cleared the table, leaving dinner for their eldest son on the stove, and went to bed with the other children. They tried to relax and get at least some sleep, but in the end they didn't close their eyes all night. They kept listening for the sound of the door downstairs. Taking turns, they checked the boys' bedroom, reassuring themselves that if Gabe was late, there must have been a reason. As soon as he got home, he would explain everything. However, with each passing hour, their anxiety grew. The mother and father couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, and although Gabe was a responsible young man, he always made an effort to call and let his parents know if he was staying late at a friend's house. He never wanted to make them worry, but this time it was different. The clock's hands moved relentlessly in circles, and the feeling of panic grew stronger with each passing minute. Doug and Sherry began to worry that their son might have been in an accident. Maybe he had been hit by a car and was now in the hospital. So the parents grabbed the phone and started calling local hospitals. They asked if a young man named Gabriel Meyer had been admitted, but none of the hospitals had any records of his hospitalization that evening. By morning, as soon as the sun rose, Doug and Sherry began calling Gabe's friends and classmates, still hoping that their son had spent the night at a friend's house. The first person they decided to talk to was a young man named Damon Kanga. He was 26 years old, a bit older than Gabe. Despite the age difference, they were good friends. Damon had previously dated Gabe's older sister, Fawn, before she left for college. He cared about his health and maintained good physical shape. He and Gabe went to the same gym and often trained together. In fact, on January 12th, when Doug dropped his son off, Damon was already waiting for him at the gym. The young man confirmed that after their workout, he and Gabe briefly went up to his apartment. After that, Gabe had mentioned something about going to the Johnston River. It seemed like he wanted to go for a swim, but Damon didn't support the idea. Doug immediately found it very strange that his son would go swimming so late at night and alone. Nevertheless, He still headed to the pontoon to check if his son was there, but Gabe was nowhere to be found by the river. That was when Doug realized it was time to contact the police and file a missing person report. The investigation into Gabriel Meyer's disappearance began with detectives trying to learn more about the young man, who he was, who his friends and family were. There were several different theories about what could have happened to him. In most cases, teenage disappearances are linked to running away from home, but after looking into Gabe's family, officers couldn't find any reason why he would have wanted to leave. His loved ones adored him, never mistreated him, and always tried to support him in everything. So, the runaway theory was ruled out. The low probability of him running away was further reinforced by the fact that there had been no recent activity on Gabe's bank account. After his disappearance, his money remained untouched. A person without financial support from their parents would still need to spend at least some money for food, transportation, or accommodations. There was also no evidence that Gabe had used any form of public transportation. Police contacted local transport services and companies to check whether the teenager had taken a taxi or an intercity bus. There were no records confirming this. The next theory under consideration was an accident. Investigators began looking into whether Gabe could have drowned or been attacked by an animal. The Johnston River in North Queensland was known to be teeming with crocodiles, making it a dangerous place to swim. Based on the accident theory, police started searching the riverbanks, as crocodiles typically hide their prey under mangrove thickets. If Gabe had fallen victim to them, his remains might have been somewhere along the shore. However, this theory also seemed unlikely, as there were no traces of the teenager near the water, no signs of his presence, no fragments of clothing, or any other belongings from the day he went missing. From the very beginning, Doug and Sherry never believed in this version. Gabe wasn't reckless. He was fully aware of the dangers of the Johnston River. Moreover, he had grown up in Florida, where he frequently went to the beach with his family. He was a very strong swimmer and knew that any body of water could become unpredictable at night, let alone a river full of crocodiles. This raised another question. Could Damon Kanga have lied about Gabe going for a swim that night? And if he had lied, could he have actually been involved in the teenager's sudden disappearance? That was what the police needed to find out. It didn't take investigators long to consider Damon Kanga a suspect, not only because he appeared to be the last person to see Gabe alive, but also because the Kanga name had already appeared in police records before. In 1991, just 2 years before Gabe Meyer's disappearance, Damon had been arrested for an attempted assault with intent to kill. He had attacked a young man named Paul Melling, intending to take his life. The crime was primarily fueled by Damon's rage over his ex-girlfriend, who had left him and started a new relationship with Paul. Damon was furious. He had quite literally lost his mind over the fact that she had chosen another man over him. He repeatedly begged her to come back, but it didn't work. His ex-girlfriend refused his advances and didn't even want to talk to him. That's when Damon decided to have a conversation with her new boyfriend. One evening in 1991, he asked Paul Melling to meet him so they could discuss the situation and sort things out. Paul agreed. The two young men drove to a quiet, secluded place. Seizing the moment when Paul turned his back, Kanga pulled out a knife and tried to stab him. Fortunately, the blade slipped during the attack, cutting Damon's own hand and causing him to drop the weapon. Paul reacted quickly. He grabbed the knife from the ground and took off running down the road. Damon then jumped into his car and began chasing him at high speed. He intended to run Paul down, but the young man managed to jump out of the way just in time. He sprinted toward the nearest farmhouse, desperately seeking help. Terrified, Paul began pounding on the door. When the homeowner answered, Paul pleaded with him to call the police. Paul Melling survived the brutal attack, and Damon Kanga was arrested and charged with attempted murder. However, for some strange reason, the charges were downgraded. Instead of facing charges for making a threat to life, he was convicted of attempted grievous bodily harm and reckless driving. His punishment? A mere 200 hours of community service, no prison time. Now, with Gabe Meyer missing and Damon being the last person to see him alive, police immediately became suspicious of him. They asked the young man to come to the station for questioning. Damon repeated the same story he had told Gabe's father. He and Gabe had worked out at the gym together. After that, they went to Damon's apartment, where he offered Gabe a protein shake. Both young men were very health-conscious and physically active, and the shake was meant to help them recover their strength. This was around 5:30 p.m. Shortly after, Gabe started getting ready to leave and mentioned that he wanted to take a quick swim in the Johnston River. That, Damon claimed, was the last time he saw his friend. Damon's story was confirmed by two of his roommates. The young men said they had seen Gabe walk outside. About 15 minutes after he left, they went to the movie theater, leaving Damon home alone. With no evidence linking him to Gabe's disappearance and witness statements backing up his alibi, the police had no choice but to release him. Grief-stricken, Doug and Sherry Meyer turned to television, making a public appeal for any information about their missing son. This led to the police receiving multiple tips from different parts of Australia. Unfortunately, every lead turned out to be a dead end. About a week later, detectives received another tip, one that would prove to be quite significant. The call came from a teenage girl. She said that on the evening of January 12th, she had been at the Johnston River pontoon with her boyfriend. At around 7:30 p.m., they were walking near the river when they noticed someone's belongings on the shore. There was a gym bag, shoes, and a few other items. The young couple thought it would be funny to throw them into the water, so they did. They never even considered who the items might belong to. They just tossed them into the river for fun. Only later, when they heard about Gabe Meyer's disappearance on the news, did they realize that the belongings might have been his. It dawned on them that he could have drowned while swimming in the Johnston River. By discarding his items, they had inadvertently tampered with the investigation. With this new information, the police decided to conduct a thorough search of the riverbed. Before sending in divers, they first had to scare away the crocodiles using explosives. Once it was safe, a dive team entered the water in search of Gabe's belongings. Within minutes, they found a wristwatch, a pair of shoes, and a gym bag lying at the bottom near the shore. The recovered items were shown to Doug and Sherry, who confirmed that they belonged to their son. However, despite this new evidence, detectives were still not convinced that Gabe had drowned or fallen victim to a crocodile attack. The police suspected that something far more sinister had happened to him, something beyond a tragic accident. The issue was that Gabe's wristwatch resembled a diver's watch. It had two clasps designed to keep it securely fastened to the wrist. Because of this, investigators believed the watch couldn't have simply slipped off his hand. Either Gabe had removed it himself before swimming, an unlikely scenario, or someone else had unfastened the clasps and thrown the watch into the water. This raised an important question. Was this part of an attempt to cover up a crime, or to create the illusion that Gabe had gone swimming and never made it back to shore? Even though Damon Kanga's alibi was confirmed by his roommates, detectives still had lingering suspicions about him. After all, he was the one who told the police and Gabe's parents that Gabe had gone to swim in the Johnston River. This led to another critical question. What could have been the motive? Why would Damon want his friend dead? It soon became clear that the motive likely had something to do with Gabe's older sister and Damon's ex-girlfriend, Fawn Meyer. Fawn met Damon at the same gym where her brother worked out. Their relationship started with casual conversations. Soon, Damon began showering her with compliments. It was obvious that he liked her. Fawn found Damon to be sweet and charming, and a romance sparked between them. However, their relationship lasted only 3 weeks. That was because, after 3 weeks, Fawn left for the U.S. to attend college in Miami. Before moving to Australia, the Meyer family had lived in the United States, and Fawn still had many friends there. She planned to stay in Florida for at least 3 years. Fawn decided that she didn't want a long-distance relationship and told Damon as much. She didn't want to give him false hope, so she cut ties before leaving. However, in that short period, Damon had gotten to know Fawn's family and became close to them. He especially bonded with her younger brother, Gabe. The two shared many common interests, particularly in sports. Doug and Sherry liked Damon. He seemed kind, polite, and friendly. They saw how much he struggled with Fawn's departure. But Damon had become overly obsessed with Fawn, even though she had made it clear from the start that their relationship wouldn't last. Shortly before Christmas 1992, when it was time for Fawn to leave for college, just a couple of months before Gabe's disappearance, her parents took her to the airport. Damon came to see her off as well. The young man looked devastated, barely able to hold back tears. Because of this, even after Fawn left, the Meyer family continued to support Damon. They simply felt sorry for him. Doug and Sherry were so kind and generous toward him that they even invited him to their home for Christmas, even though in reality they barely knew him. They just assumed that he would eventually move on and adjust to Fawn's absence. But they were wrong. Damon had no intention of letting Fawn go. He couldn't stand the thought of her building a new life in America. He wrote her letters almost every day, sometimes multiple times a day. In his messages, Damon confessed his love for her, saying how much he missed her and how unbearable the separation was for him. And this was despite the fact that they had only dated for 3 weeks, with no serious commitments ever discussed. Damon constantly begged Fawn to come back. He insisted that she should be with him in Australia because she belonged to him and no one else. He even promised to pay for her flight if she returned to him. When his pleas were ignored, he resorted to deception, hoping to manipulate her into leaving school. Damon lied, claiming he had been diagnosed with throat cancer, and then started playing on her sympathy. However, Fawn wasn't naive. She quickly realized he was trying to manipulate her. Even though she was in another country, she felt emotionally and mentally pressured by her ex-boyfriend. 19-year-old Fawn Meyer had no desire to be with Damon any longer. She made it very clear that she had her whole life ahead of her and didn't want to spend it with him. Damon, however, was not the type to handle rejection well. He couldn't accept Fawn's refusal. He couldn't stand being rejected by women. One only had to remember what had happened to the new boyfriend of his previous ex-girlfriend to see that. Fawn's parents knew that Damon had been bombarding their daughter with letters, begging her to return. They were concerned, despite the fact that they had initially liked him. But they explained to their daughter that his behavior was an unhealthy obsession and that she needed to stand her ground. She had to tell Damon to stop writing and give up on trying to get her back. Otherwise, he might cause trouble in the future. No one could predict what an obsessed and rejected man might do. Fawn followed their advice. She firmly told Damon to stop writing to her because she had no intention of returning to Australia. She made it clear that she would only leave America if something happened to her family, if a relative got sick, or if something extraordinary occurred. In other words, only if her family truly needed her. With this, Fawn wanted to make it clear that she didn't see Damon as someone important in her life and had no intention of wasting her time on him. As soon as detectives heard about the comment Fawn had made to Damon Kanga, they suspected that her words might have pushed the rejected man to take drastic action, such as kidnapping her younger brother. It was suspicious that shortly after that phone call, Gabe Meyer suddenly disappeared. Police theorized that Damon might have done something to the teenager in an attempt to force Fawn to return to Australia. The problem was, they had no solid evidence to support this theory. To get to the bottom of things, investigators decided to take a closer look at Damon's movements on the evening Gabe disappeared. According to Kanga, on January 12th, after Gabe left his apartment to go to the river, he himself rented a car. He claimed that he needed to deliver a rug as a gift to his sister, who lived in the rural town of Tully, Queensland, about a 40-minute drive from Innisfail. He said he had driven about halfway there when a heavy rainstorm began. Kanga decided that driving on country roads in a downpour would be inconvenient and unsafe. Plus, the rug was in the truck bed and could get soaked, so he simply turned around and drove back home. As a result, the rug was still sitting in his garage. Police confiscated it just in case, and to be honest, they were quite surprised by its condition. Damon told officers that he had intended to give the rug to his sister because he didn't need it. But the item was so dirty and tattered that it belonged in the trash rather than as a gift. It was strange that Damon had wanted to present it to a family member. The rug was covered in numerous stains, and at first, police suspected it might have been blood. However, forensic testing ruled that out. Next, they examined the rental car that Damon had used that night. Detectives suspected that he might have used the vehicle to transport Gabe's body, but there were no traces of Gabe found inside the car. What they did find, however, was a glaring inconsistency in Damon's story about that night. The odometer on the rental car showed that on January 12th, Damon had driven 69 kilometers. Detectives conducted an investigative experiment by driving the same route themselves. Their total distance came to just 61 kilometers, 8 kilometers less than what Damon had recorded. This suggested that Damon had likely gone somewhere else that night, somewhere he hadn't mentioned to the police, perhaps to a location where he had disposed of the body. Although highly suspicious, mileage alone wasn't enough to prove anything. It wasn't enough to charge Kanga with a crime. As part of the investigation, forensic experts conducted a search of Damon's apartment. Once again, no signs of blood or a violent struggle were found. There was nothing to suggest that a crime had taken place inside the home. It was unclear how much longer investigators would have been at a standstill if not for a call from one of Damon's acquaintances who provided information about a strange location. The friend's name was James Potter. He explained to officers that about 2 weeks before Gabe disappeared, he and Damon had gone to a place called Polly Creek, a heavily forested area near Innisfail that resembled a tropical jungle. Deep in the woods at one particular spot, Damon had planted 2 sticks in the ground in the shape of a cross, saying he wanted to return there later. But what surprised Potter even more was that Damon had asked to borrow a shovel. James found his friend's behavior odd and decided to report it to the police. With this new information, detectives headed to the designated area in Polly Creek, not entirely sure what to expect. When they arrived, they indeed found the marked spot that Potter had described. Nearby, they discovered a large pile of palm leaves covering a hole in the ground. The hole was wide and deep enough to fit a human body. It looked like a grave. However, it was empty. And it wasn't the only one. Several smaller holes had been dug in the vicinity. Perhaps Damon had initially planned to hide Gabe's body there, but for some reason, he changed his mind and disposed of the remains elsewhere. When questioned by police about the purpose of the holes in Polly Creek, Damon didn't deny anything. He claimed that he had intended to use the area to grow marijuana for later sale. Although detectives found this explanation dubious, they had no concrete evidence against him, so they confronted him directly. Where was Gabe? Rumors were circulating that Damon was responsible for his disappearance. To this, Damon responded that the rumors were false, that he loved the Meyer family, and that he would never harm any of them. No matter what he said, too many aspects of his story simply didn't make sense. The holes in Polly Creek, the old rug, the extra mileage on the rental car, and his account of Gabe supposedly going for a late-night swim. Yet none of these details were enough to prove his guilt. That's when detectives had an idea. Only one person might be able to get Damon to tell the truth, and that was Gabe's older sister, Fawn. Investigators contacted Fawn, who was still in America, and asked for her help. The plan was for her to call Damon, ask him a few questions about her brother's disappearance, and hint that she wouldn't return to Australia until she found out what had happened to Gabriel. Fawn did exactly as she was asked. She called her ex-boyfriend and brought up the topic of her brother. She didn't want to accuse Damon directly, so she simply hinted that the sooner Gabe's body was found, the sooner she would book a flight home. Unfortunately, the plan didn't work. Damon didn't say a single word implying that he had anything to do with Gabe's disappearance. Police still held on to the hope that after the phone call, Damon might try to move the teenager's body, making it easier to locate. But that didn't happen either. Damon was under constant surveillance, yet he made no suspicious moves. It was another dead end. To the deep disappointment of his parents, Gabe's case soon began to fade into the background. For the Meyer family, it was a nightmare, a frustrating sense of helplessness. Everyone knew who was responsible for the teenager's disappearance. Yet, there was no concrete evidence linking Damon to the crime. It seemed as if he would get away with it. Doug and Sherry feared that their son would never be found, and that justice for him would never be served. At least, that's how things were for the first 2 weeks after his disappearance. But then, unexpectedly, there was a breakthrough. A woman living in a rural area near Innisfail called the police station. She reported that the night before, while walking around her property, she had noticed a foul smell. The stench was so strong it reminded her of a butchered pig left out under the scorching sun. As soon as the woman described the location where she had encountered the terrible odor, detectives became very interested in her discovery. Her neighbors were none other than Damon Kanga's parents. Damon had lived in that area before moving out and getting his own apartment, meaning he was very familiar with the surroundings. 2 weeks after Gabriel Meyer's disappearance, the police finally had a promising lead. Detectives immediately rushed to the location described by the woman. After surveying the area, they quickly identified the source of the putrid smell. The spot was located near a highway. It was covered with a pile of leaves and tree branches, with a swarm of flies hovering above. It was clear that decomposing flesh lay beneath the foliage, attracting the insects. Officers cleared away the compacted leaves and began carefully digging. At a shallow depth, they quickly uncovered human remains. It was the body of 17-year-old Gabe Meyer. His corpse had been wrapped in a blanket, secured with a rope. His ankles, wrists, and hands were tied behind his back. The Meyer family finally received the tragic news. They were devastated. Until the very last moment, Gabe's parents had clung to the hope of a miracle. The woman who had reported the foul smell gave her statement to investigators. She recalled that on January 12th, the day Gabe disappeared, she had seen the headlights of a car driving down a dirt road toward the farmland where the teenager's body was later discovered. At the time, she hadn't paid much attention to the driver, but now, a week later, she was certain that the person behind the wheel was Damon Kanga, someone she knew well. It appeared that he had been searching for a place to dispose of the body. The woman also remembered seeing Damon again a few days later, riding a bicycle near the same area where the remains were found. Now she believed that he had returned for a specific purpose, to better conceal the grave. That morning, as she passed by the location, she had no idea what lay beneath the ground. But when she walked past it again later, she noticed that a pile of leaves and branches had suddenly appeared in one spot. This meant that Damon had returned to the burial site and attempted to further cover it up with foliage. After discovering the teenager's body, police finally had the evidence linking Damon Kanga to Gabe Meyer's murder. However, at first glance, the cause of the young man's death was unclear. There were no visible injuries on his body and no strangulation marks on his neck. When an autopsy was performed, the forensic pathologist found that, at the time of death, Gabe's system contained a mix of various medications. It was determined that these substances were commonly found in over-the-counter cold and flu tablets. The findings suggested that Gabe had ingested a large dose of these medications. The levels in his body were extremely high. The medical examiner concluded that after consuming a lethal amount of the pills, Gabe lost consciousness and soon passed away. During his initial interview, Damon told officers that before Gabe left his apartment, he had offered him a protein shake. Detectives believed that this was how Damon had poisoned him. with a deadly dose of medication mixed into the drink. He had likely crushed several packets of cold and flu tablets in advance and stirred the powder into the shake, ensuring that Gabe had no idea what he was actually consuming. Additional evidence supporting this theory came directly from a pharmacist who had sold the medication to Damon. Police checked local pharmacies, and at one of them, they found a receipt dated January 6, 1993. The signature on the receipt matched Damon's handwriting. The purchase? 2 boxes of cold and flu medicine. This receipt, with its specific date, played a crucial role in the case. It was discovered that on that very day, Fawn Meyer had called Damon and told him once and for all that it was over. She made it clear that he needed to stop contacting her and that she would only return to Australia in an absolute emergency. She had said this in an effort to make him finally leave her alone and accept that he had lost her forever. If only she had known how tragically her words would influence what happened next. It was a strange coincidence that just one day after that phone call with Fawn, Kanga went to the pharmacy and purchased the same pills that were later found in the victim's system. And the evidence didn't stop there. After Gabe's body was discovered, an image of the blanket in which his remains were wrapped was made public. Damon's ex-wife then contacted the police, stating that the blanket once belonged to her. She explained that when she was married to Damon, they had bedding with a similar pattern. The rope used to bind the victim's hands and feet had previously been hanging in Damon's kitchen, but then it suddenly disappeared. His roommates confirmed that the rope had gone missing right after Gabe's disappearance. Since it was nowhere to be found in the apartment, it became clear that Damon had used it to tie up his friend before taking his life. Forensic experts carefully examined the blanket and found multiple fibers embedded in it. These fibers matched those from the roll of carpet in Damon's garage, the same carpet he had claimed he was planning to give to his sister. According to police, after Gabe was killed, his body was wrapped in the blanket and then further concealed inside the old carpet roll. The bundle was placed in the back of the rental car and transported to the area near Damon's parents' home, where Gabe was ultimately buried. This explained why no DNA, fingerprints, or blood traces were found inside the vehicle. With all of this evidence in place, 26-year-old Damon Kanga was finally arrested for the murder of 17-year-old Gabriel Meyer. It was later revealed that before his arrest, Damon's sister, Deborah, had spoken to him about the tragic death of the teenager. She suspected that her brother was involved in the crime and pleaded with him to confess. Deborah told him that for once in his life, he needed to act like a man and tell the truth to the Meyer family. At that moment, something in Damon seemed to break. He admitted to Deborah that he was responsible for Meyer's death. However, he claimed that it had all happened by accident after Gabe had supposedly attacked him first. Damon said he panicked, got angry, and then, in a fit of rage, took the teenager's life. The only person he ever shared this version of events with was his sister, Deborah. But when detectives questioned him about it, he refused to discuss anything. Of course, because the police wouldn't have believed his story anyway. The crime had clearly been premeditated, so there was no point in trying to blame it on a moment of blind rage. When the case went to trial, Damon and his defense team attempted to argue that Gabe's death was an accident. In the end, Damon admitted that he was responsible for Gabe's death, but claimed that he never intended to kill him. However, the pharmacy receipt and the multiple dug-up graves of varying sizes at Polly Creek told a very different story. In fact, police had developed a chilling theory. They believed that Damon chose Gabe simply because he was the easiest to lure into his apartment and poison with a fatal drink. But the different-sized graves found in Polly Creek suggested something even darker. Damon may have considered other members of the Meyer family as potential victims as well. His obsession with getting Fawn back in Australia had consumed him to the point where he was willing to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. No one could know for sure what twisted thoughts had gone through the mind of a killer who took the life of a young man. For the jury, the prosecution meticulously pieced the case together and presented their own theoretical version of what had really happened on the day Gabe died. On the afternoon of January 12, 1993, after Gabe and Damon finished their workout at the gym, they went together to Damon's apartment. Meyer stayed there for some time, just hanging out with his friend and Damon's roommates. Around 5:30 p.m., Gabe left the apartment. About 15 minutes later, Damon's roommates also left, heading to the movie theater. For some reason, Gabe returned. Perhaps he had forgotten something. It was at this moment that Damon prepared a protein shake for Gabe, lacing it with a large quantity of cold and flu tablets. Most likely, Damon's original plan was to take the drugged Gabe to the Polly Creek area, where he had pre-dug the graves, and finish him off there. However, Damon overdosed the teenager with so many pills that Gabe simply lost consciousness. Seizing the opportunity, Damon took advantage of his helpless state. During the autopsy, the medical examiner found a tiny piece of plastic stuck to the victim's face, part of a plastic bag. Both the police and the prosecution theorized that after the protein shake knocked Gabe unconscious, Damon placed a plastic bag over his head, causing him to suffocate. After Gabe's death, Damon tied his wrists and ankles, wrapped his body in a blanket, and secured it with a rope. Before that, he removed Gabe's watch, took his shoes and bag, and moved everything to the garage. Then he rolled Gabe's body inside the old carpet and placed it in the back of the rental car. That evening, Damon went to the Johnston River pontoon and left Gabe's belongings on the shore, creating the illusion that the teenager had gone for a late-night swim. When Damon returned to his car, he was unexpectedly approached by a neighbor. The man asked Damon to drive him to the pub and back. Afraid that refusing might raise suspicion, Damon agreed. The neighbor had no idea that the entire time, Gabe's lifeless body lay in the back of the car, wrapped in a carpet. After finally getting rid of the neighbor, Damon decided to bury Gabe near the location where investigators would later find his body. The reason he didn't take the body to Polly Creek, where he had already dug graves, was that it would have required carrying Gabe's body a long distance on foot through the dense forest. Driving to the intended burial spot simply wasn't possible. Originally, Kanga had planned to take Gabe there while he was still semi-conscious, hoping the teenager would walk on his own. Now, however, he would have had to carry him entirely. Choosing a location near his parents' cottage, Damon quickly buried Gabe. Then he returned to his apartment. He did this to ensure he was home when his roommates came back from the movies, solidifying his alibi. Once that was secured, he got back in his car and returned to the burial site. There, he finished covering Gabe's body in a shallow grave. The next morning, Damon resumed his normal life, telling the fabricated story that Gabe had gone swimming that night and never returned. In February 1994, Damon Kanga was found guilty of Gabriel Meyer's murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 13 years. Once eligible, the convicted killer repeatedly filed for parole, but each time, his request was denied. The fact that Damon remained behind bars for so long was largely thanks to Gabe's parents. Doug and Sherry Meyer fought tirelessly to ensure that Damon stayed in prison for the rest of his life, believing he remained a danger to society. Had Damon been properly punished after his first violent attack, rather than receiving community service, perhaps their son would still be alive today. Following Gabe's death, Doug and Sherry co-founded a victim support group in Queensland. The organization provides counseling for families of crime victims, helping them cope with the trauma of losing a loved one. However, Damon was ultimately granted parole and released just a few years ago. So far, he has not committed any new crimes, or at least none that have been reported. His release placed a heavy burden on the Meyer family. It's a cruel reality to know that the person who took your child's life is now walking free, enjoying the world your loved one never got the chance to. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.